Hey everyone, my name's Cam, and I'm here with Allie today to discuss the topic of how animal science can correlate with philosophy in this podcast episode. Even though these topics seem to be on different sides of the spectrum, there needs to be an understanding between the two since there is no patient in the animal world that comes in without a human. As I am on the animal science side of this topic, Allie is on the humanities side in their education, so we can delve deeper and connect the two topics together. So, starting out with the animal welfare, this is just defining as the well-being of animals in general. And it's really important when it comes to animals that are being held in our captivity, especially with like any kind of production like meat, dairy, clothing, what have you. And there's also just kind of like certain laws and guidelines pertaining to this, such as like the Animal Welfare Act and the Endangered Species Act, which are federal laws. And there's also some state guidelines of like trading wild animals and possession of wild animals in the state laws. And I'm sure this varies from state to state as well, such as in Ohio, we can't really keep wild animals unless it's to release them back into the wild if they need help from us medically. So getting into the question of how does a philosophy standpoint tie in with this, I want to hear your opinion on what you think.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction there, Cam. My name's Allie. I am a women's gender and sexuality studies major with minors in political science, history, and music. So I definitely think that those are all very important morals and ethical values that you mentioned. Um, and the one thing that really gets me is because I focus so much on humans, and I adore animals. I just am a little uninformed on a lot of the guidelines or certain things that happen within the animal world, or what problems the animal community are seeing within wildlife or within captivity, and also in domestication. um, I've never really had my own pets, so it's not something I have a lot of firsthand experience on, and that side as well. Um, so that's a little bit of my background there.
Yeah. And definitely being on the medical side of it now, it is a lot different versus than just having your own pets and things.
Mm-hmm.
So medically, people bring in their animals to the clinic that I work at for just general issues, but sometimes it can be like emergency related. But we're a general practice, so nothing too crazy a lot of the time. But especially with the differences between me working around the area that we're in now versus the last area I was in, there is a lot of difference in how people see their animals. Such as, yes, my old clinic was more of like an emergency clinic per se, but we also saw just general things as well. But with emergencies, a lot of the time at my old clinic, it would be people weren't necessarily like taking care of their animals properly. And there was a lot of abuse and neglect behind that as well, which is really unfortunate. And that has like a lot of like detrimental effects on the animal, of course. Like if they're abused and neglected for so long, then it could be fatal to that animal.
Absolutely.
And then those people are still wanting to go and get more animals. But in captivity, it's a different story, I guess. Like, we use animals for our own needs, like I mentioned earlier. But the fact that there has to be certain guidelines and even federal laws in place for these animals is really just upsetting because they're also living creatures just like we are. So it's kind of like would you treat your own child like this?
Yeah. That's a great point. And also, like, thinking about it in a lot of my political science classes when I was working on constitutional law, we're talking about things like basic human rights, like following the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And, so many people are always so mad about following ADA guidelines. And it's literally the bare minimum. Like, it's,
Right.
it should be those things that should just be inherent rights for people.
Right.
And we have to have them as constitutionally protected because of people's encroaching upon them, which is really upsetting within itself. But I'm also glad that we do have those protections there so that the people who are committing these really bad crimes can, go through the court system and hopefully get what they deserve.
Right. And I mean, even animals that have been neglected or abused for so long, too, people are pressing charges against the people who are doing this. And you can serve jail time and
Good.
like even community service time and probation for it. And I mean, even same thing with people in nursing homes too. Like, there has to be certain guidelines for how people are treated in nursing homes. And I feel like a lot of the time those are kind of just like looked past, like there's certain stuff that people can get away with. Like, I have been in a few nursing homes in my lifetime, just like seeing family and like going for community events and whatnot. And some of them are so bedridden because they don't have any other choice, but the people working there aren't taking care of them properly, so they're just getting like bed sores and like not getting bathed. And I understand like people are different than animals, like, they can react differently, they can be angry, like as long as they're still well mentally, but it's really hard because animals don't have a say in this. They don't get a choice on where they live, what they eat, who provides for them. Like, horses specifically are very different unless they're not on like a pasture or anything, but they still need to be like supplemented with like grain feeds and things like that, so that way they can have a healthy lifestyle and be exercised and things like that. And some of them are like easy keepers, quote unquote, but it's still not right to just be like, oh, my horse is an easy keeper, I can just throw this amount of food in a bucket and he'll eat it. Like, that's not really ethically or morally correct in my opinion.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think it's insane that people just treat animals like a short-term hobby. I mean, when I was younger and I was getting fish, definitely wish I'd been more educated on when I was getting fish and how big a tank a betta really deserves. I hate to say that I'm a little guilty of that, but I was as informed as I could have been at the time of, 2008.
Right.
And being like 6.
But I mean, you were a child at that point too.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. But now, like, one of the things I want to do is I would love to have an aquarium one day and have like a nice big setup where I'm like also like having like the plants and everything,
Right.
having like, not just treating it as like a little, ooh, here's a little thing that I feed every morning and at night. Yeah, you should probably feed your fish twice a day. I don't know how fish eat.
Depends on fish.
I haven't had fish in like 10 years, so nobody judge me for this, please. But, that's one of the nice things that I've like experienced with living in a dorm too. Like one of my roommates had this great fish tank, and I got to see how she treated her fish and everything, and it was just a wonderful experience to be able to see like these fish getting treated properly and getting full, proper, loving care. Not just some little thing that's in water. It's it's a whole animal, even though they're not as valued as much, quote unquote, because you can't pet them or hold them.
Right.
But
Yeah, still an animal nonetheless. And if we're
exactly.
going to be the ones keeping them captive, then
Mm-hmm.
it's really on us how we treat them.
Mm-hmm.
And with children, they want every animal they see, you
Mm-hmm.
know. Sometimes it's fish, sometimes it's rodents like guinea pigs or even rabbits or anything like that. Um, so it is really hard, I'm sure, as a parent. I mean, not speaking from personal perspectives, of course, but a lot of parents want to give everything for their children.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so they do as much as they can, but if parents are also very uninformed about like how to properly keep a pet, then it's really hard. And I mean, even some like pet store workers too are also pretty uninformed, unfortunately, of how
Mm-hmm.
to keep certain animals or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Especially for some people, like it's just a place that they were able to get a job and they might like animals, but
Right,
it's not their entire field of study, everything they've ever wanted to do in life.
right.
Gotta pay the bills.
That's for sure. Um, but getting more into like the philosophy side of this, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's different. Everybody has a different mentality. Everybody sees the world differently. And it's really hard as an animal lover myself to understand like how people can treat animals so poorly and diminishing their welfare completely. So, I guess my question now is I know you also really enjoy animals and you want some in
Mm-hmm.
the future, but how do you think like people have that like mentality to just not care, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Well, my first thought is immediately that people are so selfish and self centered that they're only focusing on what's good for them in the moment, what benefits them short term, long term, or, benefits their families. Like, some people might be like, oh yeah, we're gonna get a bunch of egg laying hens just so we can have eggs and not take care of the hens properly, which I know happens a lot, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I don't know too much about that like myself, but I know it happens. They see how animals can benefit them, but not that it is a mutual relationship, especially like if you are getting an animal as a pet or as like something to be part of your food source for like the eggs. Um and it just reminds me of the different, like the symbiotic and like the different relationships that we learned in biology in like early high school, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
um and but when it's most of the time it's not going to be a positive relationship with people just assuming that animals are there to serve them in some way.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Okay. So, what I've learned so far this semester in a different course, not even pertaining to philosophy as a matter of fact, but there are three types of human animal interactions. So, there can be the interaction itself, and then there can be a human animal bond, and then there also can be the human animal relationship. Now, the interaction is more of just like you see an animal, and it can like look at you and run away, or you can feel certain feelings towards that animal, um, and it can feel certain feelings towards you as well. And
Okay.
nothing even has to happen, but that's just an interaction in itself. And then for the human animal bond, you can mentally have a bond with a specific animal, whether that's large or small or wild or domesticated, whatever. And So that bond is more of like you've had all of these interactions building up to create like sort of a trust bond, especially if you work with an animal medically. So you can do like procedures and things, and that animal doesn't necessarily have to react in a certain way, but it could be a positive or negative bond just depending on how that said person has treated an animal in the past. And then the human animal relationship, once again, can be positive or negative. However, all of those interactions and that bond that you previously have had before with an animal can build up into a relationship if you work with that animal frequently. But a lot of the time, more often than not, that relationship can be positive unless that animal is unfortunately being neglected. So that puts us at the point of this human dominant species mentality. Like, there's 7 billion plus people on this earth, but there's more animals than people on this earth. And so, yes, we use animals to hunt and everything else production wise. So, with our mentality and our ability to think and to act a certain way towards an animal or to other humans for that matter, we get into kind of like this societal hierarchy point of where like there's people that are above us and below us, like class wise or even like financially wise, or even like in a job, you have your higher ups, you have people lower than you. So when it comes to animals, we think we're the top food chain and then all animals are just below us, but that's not really true in my opinion, because we can have both sides of the spectrum. We just don't think that.
Yeah, I would agree. Like, overall as a society, we just, across all societies, I feel like there's this disconnect between, like, what we really deem not acceptable, but I'm really thinking about the like hyper focus on labeling and categorizing everything, which inherently does create those hierarchies. And if we're trying to dismantle some of those hierarchies, and especially in pertaining to animal welfare, you know, like, well, what are some ways that like we could accomplish like breaking down some of those hierarchies within animal structure? I mean, the top of the food chain definitely, like, that's, if like, how would we feel if all of a sudden some other species showed up that was more quote unquote dominant and created, like, started oppressing us the way that we oppress animals as a society?
Right.
You know, people won't like it if the tables get turned, but they think that it's one of the issues that they can just kind of set on the back burner because it doesn't necessarily pertain to them, and it's not necessarily affecting their dogs, their cats, as much as it affects, our farm animals. And, you know, I don't know,
Right.
you know.
Yeah, and I mean, sure, some animals live very good lives, and they live for a long time because of their owners. But we still have that barrier, whether we have the relationships with these animals or not. Like, there's still the barrier of humanity and animals. And I'm not saying, like, we should all act like animals or animals should act like humans, because that is not.
It's not natural.
It's not natural, no. Because they do have the ability to think, yes, but they don't have the advantages that the human population does. And all humans have a different form of mentality or thinking, as to where animals, they just know how to find shelter and eat and stay safe.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where humans come in, and there's always this fear that like animals, even domesticated ones, once upon a time started out with, of they're afraid of all humans because they don't know what's going to happen. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we're just coming at them with whatever we have or whatever we want from them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really hard to find some sort of like equivalent, and I think that's why like those acts are being put in place, such as the Animal Welfare Act and Endangered Species Act. But
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, I feel as though we shouldn't have to have these acts as like a
Mm-hmm.
human population. Not that we don't have endangered animals, but if we didn't use animals so much to our advantage, then we wouldn't necessarily have endangered animals.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we may at one point in time, because they may just stop reproducing, like humans could stop reproducing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really hard when you can see that people are out here poaching rhinos for their tusks or horns.
Mm-hmm.
And
To make a profit.
right.
It's so, not to get into this topic, but capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
That definitely doesn't help in a lot of these scenarios. But I kind of was thinking about, like, with everything you just said, thinking about how dogs have changed with throughout domestication since
Mm-hmm.
they've started as wolves, and now we infantilize all dogs that we see.
Mm-hmm.
Or we stereotype them by breed. We completely have which are the ones with the flat face?
Any brachycephalic
Yeah.
dogs. So
Tho-
like pugs and Frenchies, things
Yeah.
like that.
That's horrible.
Mm-hmm. Because we bred them that way.
Like, why?
Right.
Like, why are we doing dog eugenics?
I honestly couldn't tell you. It's the question I'm still trying to figure out.
Yeah.
Why we do half of the things we do to the animals that have been here longer than us
Mm-hmm.
is beyond me. Like, I
Mhm.
think about it a lot, especially working in the medical field. Like, I see all these brachycephalic dogs coming in,
Mm-hmm.
and people are making bank off of these animals by breeding them and
Mhm.
selling them for thousands of dollars to other people
Mhm.
just for their financial benefit.
Mm-hmm.
And same with horses too. Like, you can breed your mare to this stallion that's $5,000 if you want good genetics for a racehorse, because racing gives more money to the economy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Didn't think we would be getting on the topic of economics and government structures
Yeah.
within the animal welfare and philosophy topic, but I mean it's all inherently flows together.
Yeah.
So like there's no denying it.
It's all interconnected, and I believe it's still something we really need to look at and think on, especially from like a governmental standpoint. Like, yes, we're trying to protect these animals from certain things, but there's still a lot of things happening below the radar
Mm-hmm.
that are detrimental to the economy, whether they know it or not, like financially or in the environment itself. And I think we just really need to look farther into a lot of these questions to figure
Mhm.
out what we can do to help, why people are like this to
Mhm.
animals.
Fair. No, I definitely agree.
Alright, so just to wrap up this conversation a little bit, even though we still have all of these open questions, I really think that it's very important to understand the moral and ethical values of how we use our animals to our advantage for our society and our economy, and what this means to them. Because a lot of the time, unfortunately, this is very detrimental to them, whether people know that or not. But all things aside, with all the factors we've touched on, it's something we need to look farther into as a society in the whole and what we can do to help. And I know there are active groups and things out there that are like trying to provide more of that help. But unless we all do something to help in the long run, then we're just
No, like it's that call for action that really is what we're trying to accomplish here. I mean, people should be mad. People should be upset. People should want to stand up for animal rights. And, there's so many amazing groups out there that are working on behalf of the animals. And I'm so glad to see those resources.
yeah. I'm glad to see those resources too. I just really hope that we, as a human population, can finally like do something about this before it kills all of our animals, and then we have no resources because of our animals. Because in total, I really think that yes, there is a benefit to us having these animals and using them for production, but sometimes it just gets too far.